Hello and welcome, Exiles. Today I want to talk about updates to my build guides for the Energy Blade Inquisitor and the Relic of the Pact Gladiator. Two builds which I think are absolute powerhouses on League Start, but this patch notes they received some love from GGG, we'll put it that way. Once upon a time, Wrathpith was one of the most ridiculous items in the game, and it remained unnerfed for years. But that time has come to an end because in the patch notes, if you look very closely, at the patch notes and you search Wrathpith Globe, you will notice there's a change to the percent damage you get per 100 life. It went down to 3%. What does this mean? This means at the top end, if you volatile Val Orbit, you could get 4%, 4%, whereas previously you could get 6%, 6%. This is obviously a very sizable nerf. Now, when you play these life stackers, it isn't the only source of the percent crit chance or percent damage, but it is a very sizable source of it. This is probably the biggest nerf to both of those builds. And I want to talk about, does this kill the builds? Do the builds still work? And what is to be expected? So first off, with the Energy Blade Inquisitor, that's the one I'm noting right out the bat is the Wrathpith nerf because it's the biggest nerf. I don't know what this equates to. My guess would be in the 25 to 35% damage nerf range, depending on how leveraged you are, and that being your only percent damage, percent crit source. Obviously, with Inquisitor, you get strength and int percent crit chance scaling, so you can kind of alleviate some of the crit chance loss, but the percent damage is still a fairly sizable source. Also, Foulborn Ghostwraith received another nerf this patch, going from 40% of your base life to 35, which is about a 12 to 13% baseline nerf of this, and which mostly is your damage, but it does equate to a little bit of tank as well. Now, the takeaways from these two nerfs is, okay, we've seen some decently sized nerfs to damage here, and what's the other takeaway? Less people are going to play these items. Whenever you get things that are nerfed, people get this like, oh, I don't know if it's still good. I don't know if I want to play it, which means the items will be much cheaper. That means starting it technically gets somewhat better because you can buy the items for cheaper and get online quicker. Because what I'm about to say in these next portion is, I don't think it's really that dead. And the reason being is there were two very sizable buffs that kind of counteract these nerfs. Number one is pretty much all the base spells receive some fairly sizable either cast speed buffs or effectiveness buffs or base crit buffs. So, for example, if you were talking some of the fire spells, they got like 25 to 40% more damage just baseline in terms of effectiveness or cast speed combined with effectiveness, stuff like that. This is really, it depends on which spell you wanted to use with Energy Blade. Energy Blade is kind of like this Swiss Army knife that allows you to play whatever spell you want. And some spells got better buffs than others. Like Winter Orb got an insane buff, whereas Frostbolt got like almost nothing or not that much. You get where I'm going with this. Some spells become way better options that you can just like Freezing Pulse, for example, which you maybe wouldn't have considered before, now doesn't have to use GMP to have clear and got a fairly sizable effectiveness buff, which could mean you could play Freezing Pulse Energy Blade Inquisitor. Probably still wouldn't be one of the best spells you could, but it'd be a pretty fun option. So the point I'm trying to make here is it really depends on what spell you're using, what spell you wanted to play with the build. So I would specifically look for the patch note of say, okay, I'm an Incinerative Venting player. Let's look at what changed for that specific skill. How much better did this get or how much did it change? Because that largely will dictate how much this change affected the build specifically, depending on which spell you wanted to use with it. Next up, and this one is more of a I'm unsure about it situation, but specifically pack spells have been introduced to the game, which from what I can tell, they kind of function like war cries for spells, where you can proc them and then they give some very sizable benefit to a number of casts down the line. For example, there was a pack spell, I think it's maybe Baydat was the one I looked at that they showcased in the live stream, which gave 35% more damage with hits. It empowered your next 8 casts, and then it also added like this huge like clear speed thing where it added like a bunch of extra projectiles or it gave a bunch of extra AoE. You can look at the text, but point is this thing is a very powerful essentially buff to self-cast spells. The question is, does it feel bad to play? And until we get in game to actually play with these things, it's kind of hard to tell. My guess is it'll probably be a sizable net improvement to the spells, but ultimately until you get to play the spells, we don't really know. So that's kind of an untested thing. So these are the two really big buffs that happen to self-cast skills, which will work with Energy Blade setups. And these are the two nerfs, which I think will make the build cheaper, which potentially makes it better on a league start in terms of like you can get online faster and then you can snowball some of your progress, get better gear than you would otherwise have in terms of like previously it'd probably be more expensive to get online. That being said, Even though I think they're going to be cheaper, they're probably still desirable items. I think a lot of people will maybe still be like, yeah, I still am going to play Foulborn Ghostwrath. It's still a crazy strong item. So take this with a grain of salt. Obviously, these items are still somewhat rare. You know, Rathbeth is T2. Foulborn Ghostwrath is fairly rare-ish from the Breach tree, and the Breach tree got nerfed, so less people will be doing Breach. So factor these things in. My conclusion overall is that the build is probably at a similar strength if pack spells don't feel bad to play, which that's a big caveat. It really depends on how those pack spells play out. And I think, or it's slightly weaker. I don't think it's actually that much weaker, considering certain spells got just ridiculous buffs. For some spells, it's just straight up stronger, considering some spells got just crazy buffs. But it kind of just, it depends. And then the conclusion really is this is still probably one of the strongest ways to play a self-cast build, I would imagine. I don't think it really moved the needle that much to make other self-cast options be better per se. So all in all, I think the build's at a fairly similar place, maybe a bit slightly weaker or a slightly stronger, depending on what spells you use, and a bit of a caveat with the pack spells. Another thing that I am not going to be testing yet, but maybe potentially I'll try to make a build with it later on, is they introduced a new unique Abyss Axe. They showcased it. It had 6 Abyssal sockets. This is specifically interesting because you can use this with Energy Blade. It should be able to you can make an Energy Blade with 6 Abyssal sockets, which 2-hand Energy Blade setups can be quite strong. So there might be a world where this is ultimately maybe even stronger than our current versions of Wrathbith setups. That I don't know, but it's something I kind of want to look into and I want to mention because it's fairly interesting for that use case. Initially, when I saw this unique Abyss item, I was like, oh, this thing's kind of like the stats aren't good, but it didn't even occur to me that, oh, you could just literally turn it into an Energy Blade and you have an Energy Blade 2-hander with 6 Abyssal sockets, which is kind of crazy power in its own right. So that's the things I want to mention about Energy Blade. I don't plan to be doing more League Start testing besides this. You can always look at all the different VODs I have it on YouTube, all the different links I have to leveling runs and stuff like that. The tree isn't really changing that much, and it's just kind of a lot of the spells are getting buffed, and you can kind of make your own judgments based on that. I don't have enough time to do the testing for this. I'm going to be working on my Luminary guide, so that's the thing. You're going to be a little bit more out on your own. You're not going to be that much more out on your own because really the game didn't change that much. 99% of the DNA of this guide should be pretty accurate to what you want to do, so keep that in mind. Also, following that up with Relic of the Pact, the other league starter that I really, really like as a power league starter. This build I used last patch, went straight to doing Ubers on day 2, and it's the fastest I've ever earned a mirror on a league start. Doing Ubers on day 2 was just crazy currency, and it's all thanks to Relic of the Pact being an absolute powerhouse of an item. Again, you'll see a common factor here is both these builds used the Wrathbith Globe. Now, I want to note something specific about Relic of the Pact that isn't the same on Energy Blade, which is Relic of the Pact has lucky crit chance. That means this crit chance nerf, it doesn't hurt quite as much as it does for the Energy Blade character. It hurts a little bit less because lucky crit, like the difference in like, let's say 70 lucky crit and 60 lucky crit isn't all that much different if you catch where I'm going with this. Point is, it's less of a nerf for the crit chance. The spell damage still does hurt though. Another thing I want to note here is Enshroud on unique items, and I didn't mention this on the Energy Blade quiz. I guess I maybe should have a little bit, but Enshroud, whenever you have builds that have multiple unique items, is actually fairly interesting in terms of power increase. The big caveat is, like for this build, Wrathbith and Calm's Heart, they're both T2s. They're both kind of rare. They're going to not be a cheap item to get, but some late game potential if you really want to min-max for it. Getting yourself enshrouded items with Calm's Heart Wrathbith could maybe be some really cool outcomes. Another thing I want to take note of here is default white sockets actually kind of hurts the Untouched Soul. It used to be pretty cheap to get all red sockets to get a bunch of life from Untouched Soul. That's going to be not as cheap. Granted, you still maybe want 1 or 2 or 3 white sockets here and there to make your res everywhere else easier to be capped. So you're going to want some white sockets, but from what I understood from the Q&A and everything they were talking about it, red sockets or getting non-white sockets is going to be more expensive than it would have been previously by a fair margin. So something to consider. The Untouched Soul has a bit of a power decrease just in terms of budget because of getting those red sockets will be harder to do. Another thing I want to note here is for the Cold Dot setup specifically, not Relic of the Pact, but the Cold Dot setup specifically, they showcased a very big multiplier for damage over time skills, which is the Pact of Gore skill, which not only gave you a more multiplier on your next dot skill, but also gave you increased damage taken. That seems pretty dang strong. but it is, again, tied to the pack skills, maybe a bit clunky, just something to consider. Another thing I want to take note of here is, and this is the same thing I noted earlier with the Energy Blade Inquisitor, with nerfs that happen like these, that means less people will be competing for the same items. And if less people are competing, they become cheaper, which in turn means you can get the character online easier. So weigh that out. I think most likely the build will be cheaper next league, maybe even more on the budget end. We will see. Ultimately, Relic the Pact is still a fairly rare pull from Ultimatum, so this will probably be your big price pinch point. And Wrathmyth, I think, might be even like somewhat cheap. We will see, but that is something to consider. Maybe a bit cheaper. So my overall conclusions are it's still quite strong and possibly a more of a sneaky budget option. If less people play it, then you can pick up these items for cheaper and get your kill build online. I don't think any of the nerfs that we've seen in these patch notes stop Relic the Pact from being able to go straight to Ubers. It will be lower damage, but I don't think it'll be enough where it stops you from killing those bosses. So yeah, that's just going over the Gladiator and the Inquisitor. And one last thing I want to talk about is my conclusion for Cold Dot Glad, because I have it both on this page. I really like the Cold Dot Glad, and I wanted to keep some information for it, is I think it's a lot more mandatory to need Wrathmyth Globe, contingent on whether or not Andrew comes through with some sizable buffs for the Dot archetype. He did say in the Q&A he was working on another buff that isn't going to be in the patch notes. So maybe there's some more things that completely alleviate the loss of the 3% spell damage, which is a much more important deal for the Cold Dot setup, because the Cold Dot setup was a lot more on the edge of like, is this good damage or is this not good damage? Whereas the Relic was like pretty overkill. So losing a little bit off the top doesn't stop it from like still crushing some bosses, if that makes sense. Yeah. So anyways, that is the updates I'm going to be doing to these two guides. They should still be 99% of the DNA should be accurate to what's going to be in the next patch, with the caveat of those specific nerfs. Those are the only things I found throughout these patch notes that make any sort of impact on the build. And then, of course, they had, self-cast spells getting a number of buffs, along with the Pact options be getting basically some multipliers for spells, which may end up being really good. Maybe they'll be too clunky to use. It kind of remains to be seen. I'm going to need to actually play with them and feel those out. I'm not really too sure. I think it could go either way, to be honest. Looking at the gem information, they sound pretty freaking strong. So I'm just not sure on that one. Anyways, this is the update for those guides, in case you're wondering about looking at playing those guides on League Start. And then I will be working on my League Start, which is a guide for the Luminary, working on basically digging through the information of what mercenaries are maybe some good options to start with, along with some initial gear sets and stuff like that. So I'm working away on that. That's probably what I'm going to be covering mostly when I stream. And yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Expect some more updates on the Luminary as I fine-tune the plan for that. As always, thanks for watching, Exiles. Take care and peace out. Have a good one.